The 1970s produced some of the most talented bands that ever existed, and most of them never got the recognition they deserved. They made incredible music, filled arenas, and then quietly disappeared while lesser acts went on to lasting fame. So today, we're counting down 15 forgotten bands from the 1970s we want back. Number 15, Badfinger.
No matter what you do.
Few stories in the history of 1970s rock are as genuinely heartbreaking as the story of Badfinger. The band from Swansea, Wales were the first artists signed to the Beatles' Apple Records label in 1968, and they had everything it takes to become one of the decade's defining acts. They had extraordinary melodic gifts, tight harmonies, and a knack for writing songs that sounded like they had always existed. Their 1970 single, No Matter What, reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, and Day After Day, produced by George Harrison, reached number 4 in 1971. Baby Blue, released in 1972, became one of the most beautifully constructed power pop recordings of the decade. They wrote Without You, which Harry Nilsson turned into a global number 1 hit in 1972, and Mariah Carey turned into a number 1 again in 1994. Meaning Badfinger wrote one of the most commercially successful songs of the second half of the 20th century and received almost no recognition for it among the general public. What happened to them is one of the most painful stories in rock. Their manager, Stan Polly, mismanaged their finances catastrophically, leaving them unable to pay their bills despite significant record sales. Pete Ham, one of the band's primary songwriters and vocalists, died in April 1975. Tom Evans, the other songwriter behind their biggest work, died in November 1983. The band that should have been mentioned alongside Cheap Trick and Big Star as founders of the power pop tradition was instead remembered, when remembered at all, as a footnote to the Beatles' story. Number 14, Raspberries. The Raspberries were a band from Cleveland, Ohio, who formed in 1970 and spent 4 years making some of the most exuberant, melodically perfect power pop records of the entire decade before breaking up in 1974. Eric Carmen was the primary songwriter and vocalist, and the records the band made between 1972 and 1974, Go All the Way, I Wanna Be With You, Overnight Sensation, were stacked with hooks that should have made them one of the biggest acts in America. Go All the Way reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1972. I Wanna Be With You reached number 16. The band had genuine commercial presence and critical admiration from everyone who paid attention to pop craftsmanship. They were influenced heavily by the Beatles and the British invasion, and they wore those influences openly at a time when American rock was moving toward harder sounds and longer jams. Their refusal to follow those trends was both artistically admirable and commercially limiting. FM rock radio in the mid-1970s had little use for 3-minute pop perfection. They broke up in 1974, and Eric Carmen went on to a substantial solo career with All By Myself in 1975. But the Raspberries' catalog, particularly their final album, Starting Over from 1974, contains music that stands up against anything produced by more celebrated acts of the period. They were rediscovered by a generation of musicians in the late 1970s and 1980s who cited them as direct influences on the power pop revival, but the general public never fully caught up with the original records. Number 13, Steeleye Span. Steeleye Span occupies a unique corner of the 1970s music landscape, a British folk rock band that took traditional English and Celtic material and rebuilt it with electric guitars, drums, and 5-part vocal harmonies. They formed in 1969 and spent the next decade producing records that had no real equivalent anywhere in the contemporary music world. Maddie Pryor's voice was one of the most distinctive instruments in British rock, and the interplay between the traditional melodies she sang and the rock arrangements the band built around them created something genuinely unlike anything else. Their 1975 single, All Around My Hat, reached number 5 on the UK charts, a remarkable achievement for a band whose music was rooted in English folk tradition rather than in any commercially fashionable genre. The album of the same name sold well in the UK, and the band maintained a dedicated audience throughout the decade. But outside of Britain, they remained largely unknown. American audiences who were being introduced to British rock through the channels of FM radio and arena tours encountered Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, and the Stones rather than Steeleye Span, and the gap between their British reputation and their American obscurity was never bridged. The band went through multiple lineup changes throughout the decade, and Maddie Pryor remained the constant. Her voice the anchor that kept the project coherent through all the personnel shifts. They are still performing in various configurations today, which is a testament to the durability of their approach. But the catalog they produced in the 1970s, from Pleased to See the King in 1971 through Commoner's Crown in 1975, deserves a far wider audience than it has ever found outside of folk music circles. Number 12. Sutherland Brothers and Quiver. The Sutherland Brothers and Quiver were a British band that came together from two separate groups in the early 1970s and produced some of the warmest, most soulful rock records of the decade. Ian and Gavin Sutherland had been recording as the Sutherland Brothers, and Quiver was a separate band led by guitarist Tim Renwick and bassist Willie Wilson. When the two groups merged in 1972, they created an ensemble capable of a range that neither had achieved independently. Their most celebrated song, Arms of Mary, was released in 1976 and reached number 5 on the UK charts. The song is a perfect piece of melodic rock songwriting. Ian Sutherland's vocal was warm and direct, the arrangement was exactly right, and the whole thing had a simplicity that made it feel inevitable. It should have been the beginning of a substantial international career. Instead, it remained a British hit that never crossed meaningfully to American audiences, and the band broke up not long after without ever receiving the wider recognition their music warranted. Arms of Mary has continued to appear in British television programs, films, and advertisements over the decades since its release, which is a reliable indicator of a song's staying power in the culture even when its creators have been forgotten. Rod Stewart, who had an instinct for recognizing great songwriting in others, was a fan of the Sutherland Brothers' work and covered several of their songs. That endorsement kept their name alive in music industry circles long after the band itself had dissolved. Number 11. Kokomo, not the Beach Boys song. Kokomo was a British band formed in London in 1973 whose approach to American soul, funk, and R&B was so musically accurate and so emotionally committed that American audiences who encountered them were frequently surprised to learn they were from England. The band had a large and fluid lineup, at various points featuring as many as 10 members, built around a brass section, rhythm section, and multiple vocalists who shared lead duties across their recordings. Their 1975 debut album was produced by Steve Smith and received enthusiastic critical notices, with reviewers drawing comparisons to Tower of Power and The Average White Band. The comparison to AWB was particularly apt. Both were British bands who had absorbed American soul and funk deeply enough to produce something that felt genuinely connected to the traditions they were drawing from, rather than simply imitating them. Kokomo toured the United States in 1975 and 1976, building a following among audiences who responded to the live shows, which, by multiple accounts, were exceptional. They never broke through commercially on either side of the Atlantic in the way their talent suggested they should have. The large lineup made them expensive to tour and difficult to sustain economically, and the brief window in which blue-eyed soul and British funk had commercial traction on mainstream radio closed before they had a chance to capitalize on it fully. They are remembered today primarily by musicians and collectors who know 1970s British soul in depth. Exactly the kind of audience that appreciates quality, but not the kind that generates the commercial legacy a band of Kokomo's caliber deserved. Number 10. Montrose. Montrose was a California-based hard rock band formed in 1973 by guitarist Ronnie Montrose, and their self-titled debut album, released in 1973 with Sammy Hagar on lead vocals, is one of the most influential hard rock records of the decade. The album produced Rock the Nation and Bad Motor Scooter, tracks that became staples of FM rock radio and helped define the sound of American hard rock in the mid-1970s. The band had an unusual position in the rock landscape of the period. They were too straightforwardly hard rock for the album-oriented radio stations that tended toward more progressive or atmospheric material, but too musically sophisticated for the pure boogie rock end of the market. Ronnie Montrose was a technically gifted guitarist whose playing owed as much to jazz and blues as to hard rock, and the tension between his musical ambitions and the commercial demands of the genre he was working in was never fully resolved. Sammy Hagar left the band in 1975 to pursue a solo career that eventually led him to Van Halen. Without him, Montrose went through multiple lineup changes and released several more albums before Ronnie Montrose eventually disbanded the group. He continued as a session guitarist and solo artist for decades, but the original Montrose lineup, particularly the debut album, represents a specific moment in early 1970s hard rock that influenced an enormous number of subsequent bands, most of which became more famous than Montrose ever did. Number 9. Ace. Ace was a British rock band formed in 1972, and they had one of the more remarkable one-hit stories of the 1970s. Their 1974 debut single, How Long, reached number 3 on the UK charts and number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, a genuinely impressive showing for a debut single from an unknown act. The song is a gentle, keyboard-driven piece of melodic rock built on a beautifully simple piano riff played by Paul Carrack, who sang lead vocal with a warmth and restraint that was immediately distinctive. The problem with How Long was that it was so distinctive and so perfectly realized that everything Ace recorded afterward was measured against it and found to be something different rather than something equivalent. The band made good records. Their albums Five Aside and Time for Another both contained strong material, but none of it generated the commercial response that the debut single had, and by 1977 the band had effectively dissolved. Paul Carrack went on to become one of the most in-demand session and touring keyboardists in British rock, playing with Squeeze, Mike plus the Mechanics, and eventually becoming one half of the duo who wrote and performed The Living Years in 1988. His career demonstrated what genuine talent can achieve when it's given multiple opportunities across a long span of time. But Ace as a band, the specific combination of players and personalities that produced How Long and the 2 albums around it, was a particular thing that existed briefly and then was gone. The records they left behind reward anyone who goes looking for them. Number 8. Pilot. Pilot was a Scottish band formed in 1973 by 2 former members of the Bay City Rollers, David Payton and Billy Lyle, along with drummer Stuart Tosh. Their 1974 single, Magic, reached number 1 in the UK and number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, which placed them briefly in the commercial spotlight alongside the decade's most successful acts. The follow-up single, January, reached number 1 in the UK as well, making them one of the few acts of the period to open with 2 consecutive UK chart toppers. Magic, in particular, is a beautifully constructed pop record. The production was handled by Alan Parsons, who was simultaneously building his own career as a recording artist and producer, and the combination of Parsons's sonic clarity and Pilot's melodic gifts produced something that sounded effortless without being insubstantial. The vocal harmonies were precise and warm, and the song's chord progression had the kind of inevitability that distinguishes genuinely great pop from merely good pop. Pilot never achieved a third hit to match their first 2, and the commercial momentum they had briefly achieved dissipated as quickly as it had arrived.
It's magic, you know.
Number 7. Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant were a British progressive rock band active from 1969 through 1980, who occupied a position at the extreme edge of musical ambition during the 1970s. The band's lineup included musicians who could each play several instruments, and their recordings drew simultaneously from Renaissance polyphony, medieval music, jazz, classical composition, and hard rock in combinations that had no precedent in popular music. They released 12 studio albums between 1970 and 1980, none of which charted significantly. The band was never a commercial entity, and they appeared to have little interest in becoming one. Their live performances were legendary among the audiences who attended them for technical precision and musical ambition, but those audiences remained relatively small throughout the band's existence. Number 6. The Sensational Alex Harvey Band. The Sensational Alex Harvey Band were a Scottish rock band formed in 1972, who combined hard rock, theatrical presentation, and an almost vaudevillian sense of performance into something that had no equivalent anywhere else in 1970s music. Alex Harvey was in his mid-30s when the band formed, significantly older than most rock performers of the period, and he brought a worldliness and theatrical intensity to the stage that younger performers could not have replicated. Their 1975 live album, The Impossible Dream, captured what the band could do in performance in a way their studio recordings only partially conveyed. Their cover of Tom Jones's Delilah, transformed from an easy listening hit into theatrical hard rock, became their highest charting UK single, reaching number 7 in 1975. They also recorded Vambo Marble Eye and Sergeant Fury, originals that demonstrated Harvey's skill as a writer of character-driven rock songs. Number 5. Stories. Stories were a New York rock band formed in 1972 who had one of the decade's more striking commercial moments and then vanished in a way that remains genuinely puzzling, given the quality of their recorded output. Their 1973 cover of Brother Louie, originally recorded by Hot Chocolate, reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent 2 weeks at the top. The song's story of an interracial relationship and the resistance it faced was handled with genuine emotional intelligence, and the band's performance was committed and convincing. The lead singer on Brother Louie was Michael Brown, not to be confused with the songwriter of the same name, and the song's success represented the high point of a commercial trajectory that had seemed genuinely promising. Stories had genuine musical depth beyond the hit single, and their albums contained material that demonstrated a range and ambition that one number 1 single could not fully represent. Number 4. Chilliwack. Chilliwack were a Canadian rock band from Vancouver who spent the entire 1970s making records that should have made them household names, and instead kept them just below the threshold of broad international recognition. They formed in 1970 from the remnants of a mid-1960s Vancouver band called The Collectors, and throughout the decade they produced a series of melodic rock albums that demonstrated a consistency of quality rarely matched by more celebrated contemporaries. Bill Henderson, the band's primary songwriter and guitarist, had a gift for hook-driven, emotionally direct rock writing that made individual songs immediately likable. Their 1981 single, My Girl, Gone, 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 eventually gave them their biggest commercial success, but throughout the 1970s, they were building the foundation that made that success possible through a series of albums, Chilliwack, Riding High, Dreams, 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 that found audiences in Canada without breaking through internationally. Number 3. Lone Star. Lone Star were a British hard rock band formed in Cardiff, Wales in 1975 who made two albums, Lone Star in 1976 and Firing on All Six in 1977, that represent some of the finest British hard rock of the late 1970s and received almost no commercial recognition at the time of their release. Their guitarist Paul Chapman had a tone and a style that was immediately recognizable, and singer Kenny Driscoll brought a power and range to the vocal position that put him in genuine competition with the better-known voices of the period. Firing on All Six in particular is an album that has been consistently rediscovered by hard rock fans over the decades since its release. The production, the songwriting, and the performances are all at a level that should have placed it alongside the most celebrated British hard rock albums of the period. The reasons it didn't break through are partly practical. The band's management and label situation was not set up to sustain a major promotional push, and partly a matter of timing. The late 1970s were a complicated moment for British hard rock, squeezed between the commercial dominance of stadium rock and the cultural disruption of punk. Number 2. The Records. The Records were a British power pop band formed in 1977 who released their debut album Shades in Bed in 1979, technically at the edge of the decade, but who belong squarely in the 1970s power pop tradition that the Raspberries and Badfinger had established earlier in the decade. Their single Starry Eyes reached number 45 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1979 and received significant airplay on American AOR stations, suggesting that an audience existed for what they were doing. The band's melodic gifts were genuine. Songwriter Will Birch had a facility for the perfectly constructed 3-minute pop song that sounds effortless but is extraordinarily difficult to write. Their albums contained almost no filler, and the consistency of quality across their recorded output put them in the small company of bands who could be trusted on every track. Number 1. Cactus. Cactus were an American hard rock band formed in New York in 1969 from the ruins of two other bands. Guitarist Jim McCarty and bassist Tim Bogert had both been members of the Vanilla Fudge, and drummer Carmine Appice came from the same group. With vocalist Rusty Day completing the lineup, they recorded 4 albums between 1970 and 1972 that were among the most brutal, raw, and physically powerful hard rock records of the entire decade. Their debut album Cactus, released in 1970, established the template: stripped-down, blues-based hard rock played at maximum volume with complete commitment and zero commercial compromise. The band had none of the melodic polish that made contemporaries like Deep Purple or Led Zeppelin more accessible to mainstream audiences, and they had no interest in acquiring it. What they had instead was a ferocity of execution that was virtually unmatched in 1970s rock. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more music content like this.